Margaret Whitmore stood at her kitchen window, watching the last bit of sunlight fade behind the Montana mountains. The old farmhouse felt too quiet, too empty. She could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the living room, each sound echoing. Through rooms that once buzzed with conversation and laughter, 3 years had passed since Thomas died, but the silence still caught her off guard. Sometimes she would turn to tell him something about the chickens or ask his opinion about fixing the fence, only to remember he wasn't there anymore. The realization hit her fresh each time, like walking into a door she forgot was closed. She picked up the old kerosene lantern from the kitchen counter. Thomas had used this same lantern for 30 years, carrying it out to the barn during winter storms or late-night emergencies with the livestock. The metal was dented and the glass was cloudy, but it still worked perfectly. Her hands knew exactly how to adjust the wick and light it without thinking. The flame caught and danced behind the glass, casting warm shadows across the kitchen walls. Margaret carried it to the front window and set it on the wooden sill, just like she had every single night for the past 3 years. The light pushed back against the growing darkness outside, creating a small circle of warmth that seemed to make the whole house feel less empty. Her neighbors thought she had lost her mind. She knew they talked about it at the general store and after church on Sundays. "Poor Margaret," they would whisper, "still lighting that lantern like she's waiting for Thomas to come home from the war." But they had it all wrong. This wasn't about Thomas. He had been gone too long for her to believe in miracles like that. The truth was more complicated and harder to explain. The night after Thomas's funeral, Margaret had sat alone in the dark living room, surrounded by covered dishes from well-meaning friends. The casseroles and pies were stacked on every surface, more food than one person could eat in a month. People meant well, but their kindness only made the emptiness feel bigger. That first night, she had felt something she couldn't put into words. It was like a pull in her chest, a feeling that someone somewhere needed to see a light in the darkness. She couldn't shake the idea that her small flame might matter to someone she would never meet. Someone who needed to know they weren't completely alone in the world. Margaret had grown up on stories about lighthouse keepers who saved ships from crashing on rocky shores. Her grandfather had been a sailor before he moved inland to farm, and he used to tell her about seeing those lights appear just when hope was running out. "A light in the darkness," he would say, "is worth more than gold to someone who's lost." Maybe that was what this was about. Maybe someone out there needed to see her light. The routine had become sacred to her. Every evening as the sun set, she would clean the lantern glass, trim the wick, and fill it with fresh kerosene. She would light it carefully and place it in the same spot in the front window. The light would burn all night, a steady beacon visible from the road and the hills beyond. Some nights she would sit in her rocking chair and watch the flame flicker. The dancing light reminded her of better times, when Thomas would sit beside her and they would plan their future together. They had talked about traveling, maybe visiting his sister in California, or taking a trip to see the ocean. Those dreams felt like they belonged to different people now. The townspeople had tried to help at first. Her friend Betty from church would stop by with fresh bread and worry in her eyes. "Margaret, honey," she would say gently, "don't you think it's time to move on? Thomas wouldn't want you living in the past like this." But Betty didn't understand. This wasn't about living in the past. This was about something Margaret felt in her bones, a certainty that her small act of lighting that lantern mattered in ways she might never know. She had tried to explain it once, but the words came out wrong, and Betty had just looked more concerned. Dr. Henderson, the town's only doctor, had suggested she might benefit from talking to someone about her grief. He was kind about it, but Margaret could see the worry in his eyes, too. Everyone seemed to think she was stuck, unable to move forward with her life. They didn't realize that lighting the lantern each night felt like the most forward-moving thing. She did. Winter was the hardest time. The Montana cold was fierce and unforgiving, and there were nights when the wind howled so loud she worried it might blow out her flame. She would check it several times during bad storms, adding kerosene and adjusting the wick to keep it burning steady. On the worst nights, she would wrap herself in Thomas's old coat and sit by the window, watching over her light like a mother watching over a sick child. The flame had become her companion, her purpose. It gave her a reason to get up each morning, and a ritual that marked the end of each day. Some people might have called it obsession, but Margaret knew it was something else. It was hope in its purest form, the belief that small acts of kindness could reach further than anyone imagined. She thought about the travelers who might pass by on the main road after dark, people heading to somewhere important or running away from somewhere else. Her light would be the only sign of life they saw for miles, a reminder that civilization and kindness still existed in the vast emptiness of the Montana plains. Margaret also thought about the wild animals that roamed the hills around her property. She had seen deer and elk pause at the edge of her yard, their eyes reflecting the lantern light. Even they seemed to understand that this was a safe place, a spot where the darkness held no threat. The ritual connected her to something larger than her own grief. Every night, as she lit the lantern, she would say a small prayer for whoever might need to see it. She prayed for lost travelers, for lonely souls, for anyone who felt as empty as she sometimes did. The prayer was simple: let this light reach someone who needs it. As the months turned into years, Margaret noticed changes in herself. The crushing weight of grief had softened into something more manageable, a quiet sadness that no longer defined her every moment. She still missed Thomas terribly, but the lantern had given her a way to channel that love into something active and hopeful. Tonight, as she adjusted the lantern one more time and prepared to head to bed, Margaret felt that familiar tug in her chest. Somewhere out there in the darkness, someone needed to see her light. She didn't know who or why, but she trusted that feeling completely. Tomorrow night she would light it again, and the night after that, and every night for as long as she was able. The flame would continue to burn, a small but steady promise that, even in the deepest darkness, someone was keeping watch. Someone cared enough to leave a light on for strangers they might never meet. The lantern flickered gently in the window, its warm glow reaching out into the Montana night, carrying with it all of Margaret's hope and love, waiting patiently for the person who would need it most. Joseph Crowfeather crouched behind a cluster of pine trees on the hillside, his breath forming small clouds in the cold mountain air. Down below, the farmhouse window glowed with that familiar warm light. He had been watching that same light for almost 2 months now, ever since he escaped from the Carlisle Indian School and made his way back toward the lands his grandmother had told him about in her stories. The boy pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders. It wasn't nearly warm enough for the Montana nights, but it was all he had managed to grab when he slipped away from the school dormitory. His stomach cramped with hunger, reminding him that the handful of berries he had found that morning wasn't enough to keep him going much longer, but that light in the farmhouse window gave him something to focus on besides the cold and hunger. Every evening, just as the sun disappeared behind the mountains, the woman would appear at her kitchen window. Joseph could see her moving around inside, and then she would carry that lantern to the front window and set it down. The routine never changed, and somehow that consistency felt like the most reliable thing in his world right now. The government school had tried to strip away everything that made him who he was. They cut his long black hair the day he arrived, burned the clothes his grandmother had made for him, and forbade him from speaking his native language. When they caught him whispering Lakota words to himself at night, they would make him stand in the corner for hours, his hands raw from scrubbing floors as punishment. "Kill the Indian, save the man," the headmaster would say during his weekly speeches to the students. But Joseph knew that killing the Indian part of him would leave nothing worth saving. His grandmother had taught him that their people were connected to the land, to the animals, to the spirits of their ancestors. The school wanted to sever all those connections and turn him into something he could never be. So he ran. One night, when the dormitory supervisor fell asleep at his desk, Joseph slipped out through a window and disappeared into the darkness. He had been walking for weeks, following old animal trails and staying away from roads where someone might recognize him and drag him back to that terrible place. His grandmother used to tell him stories about their people living free in these mountains before the soldiers came and forced them onto reservations. She would describe the old ways, how they moved with the seasons, and read the signs in nature that told them where to find food and shelter. Joseph had listened to every word, storing those stories away like precious treasures. Now, trying to survive on his own, he understood why those stories were so important. They weren't just entertainment. They were instructions for how to live as a Lakota person, how to find your place in the natural world. But 12 years old was young to be testing those lessons against the harsh reality of a Montana winter. During the day, Joseph would explore the hills around the farmhouse, learning the lay of the land and searching for anything edible. He found wild onions growing near a stream and rose hips that were sour but filling. He caught grasshoppers and ate them raw, the way his grandfather had taught him during summer visits to the reservation. It wasn't much, but it kept him alive. At night, he would return to his favorite watching spot and observe the woman in the farmhouse. She lived alone, that much was clear. Joseph never saw anyone else moving around inside, and only one place was set at her kitchen table. She seemed to talk to herself sometimes, or maybe to someone who wasn't there anymore. There was a sadness in the way she moved that reminded Joseph of his grandmother. After his grandfather died, the woman appeared to be kind. Joseph had seen her feeding stray cats that wandered onto her property, and she always scattered extra corn for the chickens, more than they could possibly eat in one day. When an injured crow landed in her yard, she had gently picked it up and cared for it until it could fly again. These small acts of compassion made Joseph think she might understand what it felt like to be lost and alone, but he was still too afraid to approach her. White people had taken him away from his family and tried to destroy everything sacred to him. How could he trust that this one would be different? What if she called the authorities and sent him back to that horrible school? The risk felt too great, so he stayed hidden and watched from a distance. The light in her window had become his North Star during the confusing days when he wandered through unfamiliar terrain, getting turned around on mountain paths that all looked the same. He knew he could always find his way back by looking for that steady glow. It was like a lighthouse guiding ships safely to shore. Except this lighthouse was guiding a lost boy trying to find his way home. Some nights when the loneliness felt overwhelming, Joseph would imagine walking down that hill and knocking on the woman's door. He would picture himself sitting at her kitchen table, sharing a warm meal and maybe even telling her about his grandmother's stories. In these daydreams, she would understand why he ran away from school and would help him figure out how to live free without starving in the wilderness. But when morning came, his courage would disappear with the darkness. The light would go out, the woman would start her daily chores, and Joseph would retreat deeper into the hills to spend another day searching for food and shelter. He had found a small cave that provided some protection from the wind, but it was damp and cold. His thin blanket, stolen from the school dormitory before his escape, was barely enough to keep him warm on the mild nights. As October wore on and the temperatures began to drop, Joseph knew he was in serious trouble. Winter in Montana could kill an experienced outdoorsman, let alone a 12-year-old boy with limited supplies, but something kept him from giving up completely. Maybe it was his grandmother's voice in his memory, telling him that the spirits of their ancestors would guide him if he stayed true to who he was. Maybe it was the stubborn pride that ran through his family line, the same pride that had helped his people survive centuries of hardship. Or maybe it was simply that light in the farmhouse window, burning steady every night like a promise that kindness still existed in the world. Joseph would curl up in his cave, hungry and cold, but he would close his eyes and picture that warm glow. In his mind, he could almost feel the heat radiating from the lantern, could almost smell the kerosene and hear the gentle hiss of the flame. The light had become more than just something to look at. It had become hope itself, a reason to survive another day and keep believing that somehow everything would work out. The woman lighting that lantern had no idea she was keeping a lost boy alive with her simple ritual. But every night, as Joseph watched her place the light in the window, he felt a little less alone in the vast wilderness that surrounded him. The first snowflakes started falling on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. Joseph watched them drift down from his hiding spot in the pine trees, each flake bigger and heavier than the last. His grandmother had taught him to read the signs in nature, and everything about this storm felt dangerous. The wind was picking up from the north, the clouds hung low and dark, and the air had that electric feeling that came before the worst weather. By evening, the snow was falling so thick that Joseph could barely see the farmhouse below. The woman's light appeared in the window as always, but it looked fuzzy and distant through the swirling white curtain. For the first time since he had been watching her routine, Joseph felt truly afraid that he might lose sight of that guiding beacon. He retreated to his small cave, pulling his thin blanket around his shoulders and trying to stay positive. He had survived storms before. This one would pass like all the others, and tomorrow he would be able to see the farmhouse clearly again. But as the night wore on, the wind began to howl with a ferocity that made the cave walls shake. The storm lasted 3 full days. Joseph huddled in his shelter, listening to the wind tear through the trees above him. Snow blew into the cave opening, creating small drifts that he had to constantly push away from his sleeping area. His water bottle froze solid on the first night, and he had to hold it against his body to melt enough ice to wet his dry mouth. Food became a distant memory. The handful of dried berries and nuts he had been saving were gone by the second day. His stomach had stopped growling and started cramping instead, a sharp pain that doubled him over whenever he tried to move. He chewed on pine needles the way his grandfather had shown him once, but they did little to fill the growing emptiness inside him. The worst part was not being able to see the light from the farmhouse. The snow was so thick and the wind so fierce that he couldn't even tell which direction the house was anymore. For 3 nights he lay in complete darkness, wondering if the woman was still lighting her lantern or if she had finally given up the ritual. Maybe she had decided it was pointless to waste kerosene on a storm that no one could see through anyway. Joseph tried to keep his spirits up by repeating his grandmother's stories to himself. She used to tell him about the winter when her own grandmother was a child, when the snow fell for 7 days straight and the entire tribe had to shelter in a cave much like the one he was in now. They survived by sharing what little food they had and keeping each other warm through the long, dark nights. But Joseph was alone. There was no tribe to share warmth with, no elders to tell stories that would make the time pass faster. There was just the endless howling of the wind and the growing weakness in his arms and legs that told him his body was starting to shut down from hunger and cold. On the 4th morning, the storm finally broke. Joseph crawled to the cave opening and looked out at a world transformed. Everything was buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. The familiar landscape had become alien and hostile, with drifts piled so high that many of the trees were half buried. The sun shone bright and cold, making the snow glitter like broken glass. Joseph tried to stand but found that his legs would barely hold him. 3 days without food and limited water had left him weaker than he had ever been in his life. His hands shook when he tried to pack up his few belongings, and black spots danced at the edges of his vision when he moved too quickly, but he had to find that farmhouse. The light had been his anchor for 2 months, and now he needed it more than ever. Without it, he would wander in circles until he collapsed in the snow and never got up again. The journey down the mountainside became a nightmare. The snow was so deep that Joseph sank in up to his waist with every step. He had to stop and rest every few yards, his breath coming in sharp gasps that turned to ice crystals in the cold air. Several times he fell face first into the snow and lay there for long minutes, wondering if it would be easier to just stay down and let the cold take him. But each time, he thought about his grandmother and the stories she had told him about their ancestors who survived impossible hardships through sheer determination. They hadn't given up, so neither would he. He would drag himself to his feet, brush the snow from his clothes, and take another few steps toward where he hoped the farmhouse would be. As the sun began to set, Joseph realized he was completely lost. Nothing looked familiar in the snow-covered landscape. He had been walking for hours but had no idea if he was going in the right direction. Panic started to creep into his chest, making his breathing even more labored. Without the woman's light to guide him, he might as well be blind. Then, as the last rays of sunlight faded behind the mountains, he saw it. a warm yellow glow in the distance, steady and welcoming. The woman had lit her lantern again, just like she had every night for who knows how long. Even during the worst storm he had ever experienced, even when no one could possibly see it, she had kept her promise to maintain that light. Joseph stumbled toward the glow, falling repeatedly in the deep snow but getting up each time. His vision was starting to blur, and he could feel his body temperature dropping to dangerous levels. His feet had gone numb hours ago, and his fingers wouldn't bend properly anymore. But that light kept him moving, one painful step at a time. When he finally reached the farmhouse, Joseph was running on pure willpower. He could see the woman moving around in her kitchen, probably preparing her evening meal. The smell of cooking food drifted through the air, making his empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. He knew he should be careful, should think through his approach, but his body had reached its limit. Joseph stumbled to the kitchen door and raised his hand to knock, but his strength finally gave out completely. His knees buckled, and he collapsed against the door, his frozen fingers scratching weakly against the wood. He tried to call out, but his voice was just a whisper that the wind carried away. Inside the house, Margaret was stirring a pot of soup when she heard something that made her stop and listen. It was such a faint sound that she almost missed it over the noise of the wind still gusting around the house. But there it was again, a soft scratching at her kitchen door, like a tree branch blown against the wood. She walked to the door and listened more carefully. The scratching came again, weaker this time, and Margaret suddenly realized it wasn't a branch at all. Someone or something was on her doorstep. Her heart began to race as she reached for the door handle, having no idea that she was about to discover the person her nightly light had been calling to all along. Margaret opened her kitchen door to find a young Lakota boy collapsed on her doorstep, his lips blue from cold and his thin body shaking uncontrollably. Snow had gathered on his dark hair and frozen to his threadbare jacket. For a moment she stood frozen in shock, then her instincts kicked in and she dropped to her knees beside him. "Oh, my Lord," she whispered, feeling for a pulse at his neck. His skin was ice cold, but she could feel a faint heartbeat beneath her fingers. Without hesitation, she hooked her arms under his shoulders and dragged him into the warmth of her kitchen, kicking the door shut behind them. The boy was unconscious but breathing. Margaret had seen hypothermia before during her years as a farmer's wife, when workers would get caught in sudden storms. She knew she had to warm him slowly or risk sending his body into shock. She grabbed every blanket she could find and wrapped him carefully, then built up the fire in her kitchen stove until the room was almost uncomfortably warm. For the next 6 hours, Margaret worked to save the boy's life. She rubbed his hands and feet to restore circulation, held warm cloths against his face, and slowly gave him sips of warm broth when he briefly stirred. She had no idea who he was or where he had come from, but none of that mattered right now. A child was dying on her kitchen floor, and she would do everything in her power to prevent that. As dawn broke, the boy's breathing became more regular and some color returned to his cheeks. Margaret had dozed fitfully in her kitchen chair, waking every few minutes to check on him. When his eyes finally fluttered open, she was ready with a cup of warm milk sweetened with honey. Joseph looked up at the white-haired woman kneeling beside him, confusion clouding his dark eyes. The last thing he remembered was scratching at a door, desperate and freezing. Now he was warm and dry, wrapped in soft blankets that smelled like lavender and soap. His first instinct was to run, but his body felt too weak to move. "Easy now," Margaret said softly, her voice gentle, as she would use with a frightened animal. "You're safe. You were nearly frozen when I found you. Just rest and let yourself get warm." Joseph tried to speak but only managed a hoarse whisper. Margaret brought the milk to his lips and he drank gratefully, the sweet warmth spreading through his chest. She didn't ask him any questions, didn't demand to know who he was or why he had been out in the storm. She simply cared for him like he was her own grandchild. Over the next 3 days, as Joseph slowly regained his strength, a careful dance of communication began between them. Margaret spoke in slow, simple English, and Joseph responded with the broken words he had learned at the government school. But they found that they could understand each other in ways that went beyond language. When Joseph winced as he tried to sit up, Margaret was there with pillows to support his back. When she saw him staring longingly at the window, she helped him to a chair where he could watch the snow-covered landscape outside. These small acts of kindness spoke louder than any words could. Margaret noticed things about the boy that told her part of his story. His hair had been roughly cut, probably with dull scissors, and was just starting to grow back. His thin frame suggested he had been hungry for a long time, not just during his ordeal in the storm. Most telling of all were his eyes, which held the guarded wariness of someone who had learned not to trust adults. Joseph, meanwhile, watched Margaret with growing amazement. She moved around her kitchen with practiced efficiency, cooking meals that filled the house with wonderful smells. She hummed old songs while she worked, and sometimes she would pause to look out at her chickens with obvious affection. This was nothing like the cold, institutional atmosphere of the boarding school. On the fourth day, Joseph was strong enough to help with small tasks around the house. Margaret showed him how to gather eggs from the chickens, speaking to the birds in a gentle voice and introducing him as if he were an old friend coming to visit. The chickens seemed to accept him immediately, clustering around his feet and pecking hopefully at his jacket pockets. "They think you might have corn," Margaret explained with a smile. "Thomas always carried treats for them in his pockets. They haven't forgotten that, even though he's been gone 3 years now." It was the first time she had mentioned Thomas, and Joseph sensed the sadness in her voice. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, he gathered his courage and asked, in his halting English, "Thomas, he was your husband?" Margaret nodded, her eyes growing distant. 35 years we were married. He died of pneumonia one winter, caught it helping a neighbor whose barn had caught fire. She was quiet for a moment, then looked at Joseph. "I've been alone since then. Well, mostly alone." Joseph understood loneliness. He had felt it every day since being taken from his grandmother, and especially during those weeks hiding in the mountains. But something about this woman made the loneliness feel less sharp, less overwhelming. As the days passed, they developed their own system of communication. Margaret would point to objects and say their English names, while Joseph would respond with the Lakota words his grandmother had taught him. Margaret surprised him by recognizing some of the words. Her husband had worked on cattle drives that crossed reservation lands, and he had picked up bits of several tribal languages. "Mni," Joseph said one morning, pointing to the water pitcher. "Mni," Margaret repeated carefully, her pronunciation awkward but sincere. "Water," Thomas used to say that word. He said the Lakota cowboys he knew could find water anywhere, even in the driest country. These conversations became the foundation of trust between them. Joseph began to tell her fragments of his story, how the government men had taken him from his grandmother, how they had tried to make him forget everything about being Lakota. Margaret listened without judgment, her face growing sad and angry as she understood what had been done to him. In return, Margaret shared her own stories. She told him about Thomas, about their dreams of traveling and their quiet life on the farm. She explained why she lit the lantern every night, how it had started as a way to cope with grief but had become something more, a beacon for anyone who might need to see a friendly light in the darkness. "I never knew who I was lighting it for," she admitted one evening as they prepared the lantern together. "But now I think maybe I was lighting it for you all along." Joseph helped her carry the lantern to the window, understanding now that he had been part of this ritual from the very beginning. He was the lost traveler the light had been calling to, the person who needed to know that kindness still existed in the world. As winter deepened around them, the farmhouse became a place of healing for both the lonely widow and the runaway boy. Margaret had found a purpose beyond her grief, while Joseph had discovered that not all white people were like the ones who ran the boarding school. In caring for each other, they were both learning how to hope again. The knock came on a cold November morning while Margaret and Joseph were having breakfast. 3 sharp raps on the front door, official and demanding. Joseph's spoon froze halfway to his mouth, his eyes wide with the terror of someone who knew exactly what that sound meant. Margaret stood slowly, her jaw set with determination she didn't know she possessed. Through the front window she could see a tall man in a dark uniform standing on her porch, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Behind him waited another man with a clipboard in the kind of cold, bureaucratic face that Joseph had learned to fear at the boarding school. "Joseph, go to the back room," Margaret said quietly, but Joseph was already shaking his head. "They will find me," he whispered in his broken English. "They always find us." Margaret walked to the door and opened it just wide enough to step outside, pulling it firmly shut behind her. The Indian agent looked her up and down with obvious disapproval, taking in her work dress and the flour still dusting her hands from making morning biscuits. "Ma'am, I'm Agent Williams from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We have reason to believe you're harboring a runaway from the Carlisle school, a boy named Joseph Crow Feather. We're authorized to search these premises." Margaret crossed her arms and planted her feet firmly on her own porch. "You're not authorized to do anything on my property without a warrant, and I don't see any papers in your hands." Agent Williams stepped closer, trying to intimidate her with his height and official manner. "Ma'am, that boy is government property. He belongs at the school where he can receive proper education and learn to be a productive member of civilized society. Hiding him here is a federal crime." "That boy is not property," Margaret said, her voice rising with anger. "He's a child, and he was nearly dead when I found him. If your school was so wonderful, why did he run away from it?" The second man, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "These Indians don't know what's good for them. That's why the law requires them to attend our institutions. We're trying to help them." Margaret had heard enough. She stepped back toward her door, her hand on the handle. "Get off my land. If you want to take that boy, you'll need to bring a judge's order. Until then, he stays with me." She went back inside and locked the door, her hands shaking with adrenaline. Joseph sat at the kitchen table, his face pale but his shoulders straight. He had heard every word through the thin walls. "They will come back," he said simply. "Then we'll be ready for them," Margaret replied. Though she had no idea how she was going to fight the entire United States government that afternoon, Margaret hitched up her wagon and drove into town to see Henry Peterson, the only lawyer within. 50 miles? Peterson was a thin, nervous man who usually handled property disputes and wills, but he listened carefully as Margaret explained the situation. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said when she finished, "what you're asking for is extremely difficult. The federal government has broad authority over Indian children. They can compel attendance at these schools." "But surely there must be something," Margaret insisted. "What if I wanted to adopt him legally? What if he became my legal guardian?" Peterson rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Well, there have been a few cases where white families have gained custody of Indian children. It's rare, but not impossible. We'd need to prove that the child would be better served in your care than at the government school." Over the next several weeks, Peterson began building a case. He gathered testimony from the town doctor about Joseph's condition when Margaret found him, evidence of the harsh conditions at the boarding school, and character references for Margaret from her neighbors and church members. Meanwhile, Margaret and Joseph prepared for the legal battle ahead. Joseph's English improved rapidly as Margaret worked with him every evening, helping him practice the words he would need to tell his story to a judge. She also began teaching him to read, using Thomas's old books and the family Bible, but Joseph taught Margaret things too. He showed her how to read the weather patterns in the clouds, knowledge his grandfather had passed down through generations. He taught her about the medicinal plants that grew wild on her property and how to prepare them for treating common ailments. Most importantly, he shared the stories his grandmother had told him about Lakota history and traditions. "My grandmother, she say our people are like the grass," Joseph explained one evening as they worked together to prepare the evening lantern. "The fire come, it burn everything down. But the roots, they stay deep in the earth. When the fire gone, the grass come back stronger." Margaret understood that Joseph was the grass and the boarding school had been the fire. But his roots were still deep in the culture his grandmother had given him. And in her care, those roots could grow strong again. The legal proceedings dragged on through the winter. Agent Williams returned several times with various threats and official-looking documents. But Peterson had filed the proper paperwork to keep Joseph with Margaret while the case was being decided. The lawyer was more optimistic than he had initially been, especially after interviewing Joseph and seeing how much the boy had flourished under Margaret's care. The turning point came when a journalist from the regional newspaper got wind of the story. The article he wrote, titled "Widow Fights Government to Save Indian Boy," was picked up by newspapers across the country. Suddenly, Margaret was receiving letters of support from strangers, offers of financial help for legal expenses, and visits from other families who had similar struggles with government agencies. The publicity forced the Bureau of Indian Affairs to be more careful in their handling of the case. They couldn't simply take Joseph away without looking like they were bullying a kind widow who had saved a child's life. In March, the judge finally made his decision. Joseph could stay with Margaret permanently, provided she agreed to ensure he received a proper education and maintained his American citizenship. The courtroom erupted in applause when the verdict was read, and Margaret hugged Joseph tight as tears streamed down both their faces. That evening, as they prepared their nightly ritual with the lantern, everything felt different. The light they placed in the window was no longer a beacon for the lost, but a celebration of the found. Margaret had discovered that her purpose wasn't just to grieve for Thomas, but to open her heart to someone who needed a family. Joseph had learned that not all white people wanted to destroy his culture, and that it was possible to learn new ways while keeping the old ones alive in his heart. Together they represented something new, a family created not by blood, but by choice and love. As spring arrived and the snow melted from the Montana hills, neighbors would often see two figures working together in Margaret's garden. The older woman would be teaching the young man to plant seeds, while he showed her which wild plants were good for medicine. They had become teacher and student to each other, grandmother and grandson, by choice rather than birth. The lantern still burned in the window every night, but now it illuminated a house full of laughter and conversation, where Lakota stories mixed with Irish lullabies, and where two lonely souls had discovered that family comes in many different forms.